So what we've been doing before the Christmas break, we started in the book of Ecclesiastes, and David, this is David, our senior associate pastor, whose wife is in Kansas City, right? St. Louis, I'm sorry. I got Kansas City on my mind. And so he's taking care of the kids this week, all by himself. So pray. He's taking advantage of the free child care. That's what he's doing. I'll tell you exactly what he's doing. So we started on the book of Ecclesiastes, and what we've been doing is some nights we stay together here. Tonight we're actually going to do girls and guys, but stay in this room. So the girls will go over there and the guys will go over here, because I have an actual thing I'm going to have the chairman of our deacons pass this out. This is Demetrius. And I thought it'd be good before we launch in. We made it halfway through Ecclesiastes before Christmas. And I thought it'd be good to do a quick review of the first 6 chapters before we launch into chapter 7. Come on up here. Come on. Come on. Yeah, come on. Yeah.
Come on, Ken.
Yeah, come on.
Most of us ate, so we won't bite.
Yeah. Yeah, what's that? That's okay. That's all right. Yeah, we're glad you're here. So, so what I have tonight is I'm not gonna teach you for 40 minutes. I have an exercise I want you to do, where we're gonna put the ladies over here and the guys over here, and I'm gonna give the ladies the first 3 chapters, and we're gonna take chapters 4 through 6, the guys, and essentially what I've done is I've given you some structured questions to walk through, a review of the chapters that we look at, and then some applicational questions at the bottom, okay? So what you're really going to do is, so guys, we're going to do chapters 4 through 6 together. And what I'm really looking for is, what are the major themes or the major ideas in this particular chapter? So we'll have to skim, read it, and review. If anybody hasn't read it before, then it's a pretty easy read. How would you summarize this chapter in a simple phrase or a simple sentence? So if we were saying, Solomon, you're the pithy guy, you're the guy who wrote Proverbs, why don't you give us one simple statement or one simple sentence that, how would Solomon summarize chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, etc.? Then he raises these issues. And they're repeating. I mean, I thought about trying to do a chart of how these, possessions, materialism, pleasure, toil, labor, all that. But I think it would just be a bunch of scribbles, because he just kind of cycles through every chapter of these. But each chapter has an emphasis on 1 or 2 of those. So what does he say about it? If somebody said, well, what did Solomon say in chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes about the subject of toil? What would you say, right? Yeah. So this is a good exercise, because it helps us summarize and synthesize. I'm not getting my S's out there.
Think and shrink.
Think and shrink. Okay. Is that like a diet plan or what? Okay.
The BSF plan.
Oh, the BS. Okay. Yeah. So when we get to chapter 12, we should be able to say, out of 12 chapters, here's the theme of the book, here's the ideas that were presented, here's what Solomon says about each of these ideas, okay? And what conclusions does he come to about these ideas? And specifically, and particularly, what advice does he give us in how to deal with the futility of life in each of these areas, okay? And then the next thing is, when we study, we start where we are and we work our way outwards. So if I'm in chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, then I would then work through the next chapter and the next chapter, and sort of in concentric circles, I would work my way out and see the themes that are there. And then at some point, I would go to all of the wisdom literature, okay? Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and see what the themes are there, because words that are used in wisdom literature don't necessarily mean the same thing as those same words used in historical literature or in an epistle or something like that. So what I'm really asking in that last question is, are there any other passages of Scripture or any other stories in the Scriptures that speak to these issues, or I would add, if I were typing this, I would add, or demonstrate these issues. For example, when Jesus gives a parable, or if he tells a story about a particular person, or Paul is dealing with a group of people, or David is dealing with folks in the Old Testament, do any of those stories really give us, oh, so that's what that looks like? Solomon gave us the principle in Ecclesiastes, but now we get the picture, okay? And then the applicational, every one of us has all these issues. You can't avoid them. It's just part of life, right? So which of these issues for you in particular are the most prominent in your life? Or maybe if I was really being honest about myself, I would say in this particular season of my life, which one is more prominent than the others when he's talking about this and this and this and this. And I'm throwing in Christmas, your Christmas experience, because Christmas is the time of year when all this stuff comes together all in one mad rush, right? Materialism, possessions, physical health, joy, sorrow, broken relationships, good relationships, and so forth and so on. So, what's that?
Yeah, don't forget food.
Food, yeah. Okay, food. I'll do it with both my hands, food. So I'm asking you, what did you experience over the Christmas holiday? And I put it in there, physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, financially, because that's what he's talking about. And so we have an immediate lab we just came out of that reminds us of these things. And so does this study of Ecclesiastes help you in any way? Or did it, as you entered into Christmas, did it help you in any way? And then I add the question, what is the most difficult area of your life to find real meaning in? And you know why that question is important? Because that's where you will find your idolatry, your addictions. And I'm not just talking about drugs and alcohol and sex. I'm talking about running and working, workaholism, and I'm talking about food, and I'm talking, we all have these things that make our life feel better, give us pleasure, or give us relief, or whatever the case may be. So if there's a particular area that's really difficult for you, that's where you want to go to think through, do I have like a little idolatry thing going on here? I'm trusting in something other than God. Classic example of that is if you have a really tough family life, extended family life, and you're coming into Christmas and you're starting to tighten up on the inside, right? Then what do? You might bury yourself in the kitchen fixing food, or you might sit in the corner and eat and watch football. There may be all kinds of things that you do. So I'm challenging you to think through, once we see what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, then let's ask the question, what does Ecclesiastes see in us? And then always, I didn't print the last question. How woke are you? No, I'm kidding. My iPad, it messes with me all the time. I typed that, I printed it, it was perfect, and then it wasn't. So never mind. That may be my area of stress. Here's the real question. The end of the evening question is always this. I chose these words carefully, what real and meaningful changes, not what we're going to talk about, what we're going to affirm to each other, but what real meaningful changes are necessary based upon what we learned tonight for you to live differently in this new year. Meaning, of course, better, differently, right? How will you be able to find meaning and joy in the dailiness, that's supposed to say dailiness of your life? And the last question, which didn't print, is how would your brothers and sisters in Christ help you with that? I mean, we come out of these meetings, I go, man, I need to work harder at this, but I didn't stop long enough to have my brothers pray for me and call me in the middle of the week and ask me, say, how's that doing? How are you doing with that? So that's the idea. And I want to get the guys over here and the gals over here. And let's just start through. Ladies, you have the first 3 chapters. And just scribble out some notes, and then I'm going to gather us together here in just a little bit. And we'll share what we learn, okay? Take the time to make sure everybody knows everybody. Get all their passwords, bank account numbers, all that important stuff. So, all right.
I'm handing out bills, so come on.
Let's talk. Come on, ladies. Come over here.
Look at us men, always calling the ladies over.
I know. I thought I'd
Always
have to keep them off of you, but
Ain't gotta worry about that.
come on, ladies. Join us. Join us.
Bien con nosotros. Sí.
All right. Okay, guys. Ecclesiastes. David, what's the theme of Ecclesiastes? How did we say this?
There are a lot of themes. Broadly speaking, it's about how to live wisely in a fallen world.
How to live wisely in a fallen world. And then you make sure that you define what you mean by wisely and what you mean by fallen. Solomon tends to use pretty extreme language when he talks about the fallen world. He talks about vanity, total uselessness, futility. That's on the extreme end of the language. But I can't prove this, but it's not my theory only. But there are a lot of people who think that Solomon wrote the Song of Solomon when he was a young man, first married. So you get all that love and sexual stuff and everything in Song of Solomon. So much so, by the way, that in the early days of the church, they didn't teach that as a relationship between a man and a woman. They taught it as a relationship between Christ and the church, because they blush their way through it. If you get a good modern translation of the Song of Solomon, you'll go, okay, now I get it. And then over the years, he wrote Proverbs, which was his observation as he's looking at life. He's observing nature, he's observing human nature, and so forth and so on. And then there's a kind of a theory that toward the end of his life, as an old man, he wrote Ecclesiastes. And if you remember anything about the history of Solomon, he was pretty much, he'd kind of fallen away from his faith by the end of his life. His life did not end well in terms of his walk with God and so forth. And so there is a little bit of a tinge of cynicism in some of the things that he says. I want to be kind here, and I want to honor, the inspiration of Scripture. But he's an old man. He's looking back at life, and every once in a while you get a lot of disappointment in between the verses, and some just stated right out there. So I think it helps to put that in perspective, because yes, for those of us who are older, this is a really good book to challenge us to look at our life, look at our past, think about what's left of our life. As Moses says in Psalm 90, teach us to number our days so that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. And then I think as younger people especially, because it's really rare, extremely rare, and more rare today than it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago, to find a young person who's willing to listen to an older person. And I didn't listen to my parents I thought they were way out of touch with reality and so forth. And they taught me a lot as I look back. But Ecclesiastes is a great book for young people to study and go, yeah, one day you're going to be old and cranky, and you're going to have lived through a fallen world. You're going to have the scars to prove it. What are you going to, when you're looking back, what are you going to do? What are you going to wish that you had done a different way? I'm having that. I bring that up because I'm having that conversation with myself right now. I turned 68 in April, and Allison and I are talking, about our life together. We're coming up on 49 years of marriage together, and 5 years before that, we knew each other and dated some. So we've put in some time, and we've gone through some things. And I said to her the other day, I said, if you could do it over again, would you live your life differently? And she didn't even blink. She said, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And I was right there with her. Ecclesiastes is a good book to read, to talk about those kind of things. So, ladies, I gave you 1 through 3 because I wanted you to have the joy of chapter 3 of the beautiful poetry there, a time to be born, a time to die, and so forth. So let's work through these questions real quick. We'll be done right at 8 o'clock. And I wrote these out for you so that you can take them home. Always, we only just scratch the surface when we're here together in the group. Take it with you and study it on your own or with your spouse or with your kids or in a group. So, chapter 1, I'm just going to read the first couple of verses because it sets the tone for the whole book. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. That kind of runs through every verse to the very last verse of chapter 12. So give us the major themes, ideas that you saw in the chapter, and how would you summarize this chapter in a simple idea or phrase? Ladies?
There's nothing new under the sun.
Okay, nothing new under the sun.
There's weariness. Life is repetition. There's nothing new that can satisfy us.
Okay? Nothing new, wearying, repetition. It's easy to look at the modern technology and say, well, we have a lot of new things, but the reality is what Rob said a minute ago, there's nothing new under the sun. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, people are people, and we're all looking for basically the same things that this world can't give to us. So if you gave a title to this chapter, what would it be? Anybody? Not all at once. Raise your hand. Is that all there is? That's great.
That's good. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. That's all, folks. Chapter 2. Chapter 1, by the way, before we leave chapter 1, he says all that. All things, verse 8, are full of weariness. We can't even talk about it. The eye is never satisfied with what we see and so forth. But then he starts into these different ideas in life that we try to break that monotony and break that sense of tedium and worthlessness. And he starts with the idea of wisdom, because Solomon, of course, was known to be the wisest man in the world of his age. And he was famous for that. And, why not just start at the top and work your way down? He starts with wisdom. And he says, I applied my heart to seek and to search out wisdom about everything that is done under heaven. So this is a guy, he's not superficial in what he's seeking. He's a deep dive guy. He looks, he reflects, he ruminates on things. And that's where he begins with the thing that I'm most known for, the thing that I'm most famous for, my spiritual gift, if you will, because it was a spiritual gift. Because God asked him what he wanted, and he asked for wisdom. So the thing that makes my life so well known and most fulfilling is futility. And it's something that the Scripture commends. To seek wisdom, to have wisdom, to share wisdom, to teach wisdom. So even the things that the Scriptures commends, he says, in and of themselves, are not things that bring meaning to our life. Chapter 2, he talks about what? The futility of what things? Anybody? I'm sorry? Pleasures. I'm sorry? Yeah. Pleasures, all kinds of pleasures. He had a lot of them. He had a lot of wine, women, and song, for sure. And whatever he didn't have, he went and got more. And so this is a guy, he even says, I did not keep anything from myself. I gave myself anything myself wanted. And he was able to do it. And if that's not a picture of the hedonism of our day, I don't know what is.
But did he get it delivered in 2 days?
What's that? Oh,
But did he get it
it's
delivered?
true. We have Amazon. He didn't have Amazon. That's right. And he didn't have Twitter or TikTok.
That's probably a better...
There's probably a Hebrew word for TikTok, don't you think? So, so self-indulgence, hedonism, whatever you want to call it, there's an end to that real quick. It doesn't take long before, anybody who's ever sat down at Thanksgiving table and eaten a bunch of good food and then had the banana pudding or the pumpkin pie or whatever, and then gone, oh, you can't even get away from the table before you're going, all right, the consequences of this choice are not good. What else does he talk about in chapter 2? Anybody? Come on, ladies.
Be listening to his heart, but not the voice of God. Because whatever pleased his eye, he was seeking. It looks like his flesh was more important to him.
He's listening to his own heart instead of the heart of God.
The heart of God.
Yeah.
Just giving him into what the flesh wants, and the flesh always wants.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just giving it into the flesh without knowing that there is a limit to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and we see that in our time, that shows up in the, follow your heart. Whatever your heart's telling you to do, follow your heart. And I've followed my heart before, and I fell off a cliff and busted my face, so to speak, spiritually and otherwise. But that's even in the church, isn't it? We talk about, my passions, my gifts, what is on my heart to do, as opposed to what does God say in His Word? His Word is very clear about what He wants us to do. So he's following his flesh, and the flesh will. So what's the saying we have on our refrigerator? Sin will take you farther than you want to go, keep you longer, stay, and
Cost you more than you want to pay.
the following of the flesh. Well, Paul says it in the extreme. He says the flesh leads to death, and the spirit leads to life. So what else do you see in chapter 2? Real quick. What do you think he means in verse 12 and following, the vanity of living wisely? Why would a man of God make a statement like, I turn to wisdom, I turn to consider the difference between wisdom and madness and folly, and this is a conclusion I come to, that what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Is he saying don't seek wisdom?
Ends in the means of itself is not what brings you satisfaction. It's the Lord that brings it.
Okay. Yeah. What else?
I was going to say something like, not to jump on the ladies' territory, but
You can jump in.
you talk about the fall, right? Being promised to know good from evil and you're not surely going to die. Well, what good does that have brought us except for more ways to separate ourselves from God?
Yeah, you see the cynicism of, okay, I'm watching these guys over here, and they're seeking wisdom with all their heart, and I'm watching these guys, they're absolute, abject fools, and they both die, and we bury them. That's kind of where he's coming from. I don't think he's saying there's no value in wisdom. He's looking at the end. He's right close to the end of life. He's looking at what happens in the next, behind the next curtain in his life. And he doesn't see a difference. And what's interesting is the Hebrews did not have a well-developed theology of heaven or what happens after. It was kind of just broad. You go to the place of the dead. You go to the wicked go to Sheol. The righteous go to be with God. But it's not developed like in the New Testament where we have heaven and the kingdom of God and all of that. So he's working out of that framework. Chapter 3, a time for everything. What do you make of that poem at the beginning? Mm-hmm. There's a season. Do you think all those seasons that he mentions are necessary? Is he saying that, in life, it's necessary to be born and to die, to plant, to pluck up, to kill, and to heal? Or is he just acknowledging that that's what happens? You guys can jump in on this.
I think it happens in the world. Not everybody's going to have certain aspects of what is contrasting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I may not ever kill anything. Although,
Wait a minute, you never killed a fly or?
A roach.
look, I'm not talking Hinduism here, okay?
I think, especially if you take it with the other portions of the chapter, it really points to the idea that life is very temporal and temporary and passing.
But he draws some conclusions. And this is where I want to get to in the middle and end of chapter 3. Have you guys read A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis? Okay, I'm going to give you some advice. It's a great book to read. It's C.S. Lewis writes about his wife, who was an atheist. He married this woman. He loved her dearly. She died of cancer, I think. And he went through the grief of losing this wife. And so he writes this book of observations about his going through grief, so it's A Grief Observed. But I've handed that book to several people over the years, and I say to them, promise me you'll read all the way to the end. Because if you read the first 4 chapters of A Grief Observed, you will become an atheist. I mean, he's just brutal. And chapter 5 is where he resolves his faith and all that. But if you quit in the middle, you don't get the point. And I thought of that because I think Solomon's the same way in this book. He goes on and on and on about the futility of life and the hopelessness and the worthlessness. But then you get to where he talks about in chapter 3, he's made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he's put eternity in the man's heart and so forth. He gives us these little glimmers of hope. And so he says, we go from dust to dust. We're born out of dust. We die and go back to the dust. And he says, verse 22, there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work. He goes on, he uses, as we get further and further into the book, he uses the word joy. He actually uses the word joy in the context of this thing that he's writing. It's pretty amazing. So let's go to chapter 4 real quick. We've got about 14 minutes left. Chapter 4, give us the summary. What does Solomon say? What issues does he bring up? What does he say about them? Oh, you got bailed out on by the...
Yes.
All right.
Everything is, everything that you can see under the sun is pointless. And then he goes in and he specifies certain things like it's better to be with two people or have two people than one. It's better to be young, full, young, full than an old, rich, wise person. It's better to toil and what was it, for toil and all skill works come from a man's envy of his neighbor.
So you talk about motive there. Is he saying
Yeah.
you work hard because your neighbor has a better car than you?
That's what we were talking about.
Has a better house? Yeah, okay.
The rat race, if you get to the top, you're still a rat. I think some authors say that.
Oh, come on, claim that for yourself. That's clever enough.
But mainly that, there's a lot of aspects of life that are hard to justify if you look at the big picture.
Yet those are the things we give so much energy to, right? And let's be honest, as guys especially, those are the things we find our identity in. If not the things itself, but maybe it's the capacity we have for creating them and providing for them and paying for them. At least the ladies have the possibility of having their identity in relationship with their children. There's something at least meaningfully relational there that they're much better at than us. We can do it, but it's harder. We have to work a lot harder at it. So, what about chapter 5? Wake up, Clark. There you go. I'm teasing Clark. Rob?
It's about being cautious and slow to speak, how you walk into the house of the Lord, be reverent towards God in your speech and how you act. Don't be hasty to make vows, those kind of things.
Yeah, we have a mutual friend named Bud Toole who is a great old guy. He's the guy that first took me to Russia, and I've traveled with him many times. He's in poor health. And I've had 3 independent Russian pastors say the same thing about Bud Toole to me, just independent of each other. They all said, Bud Toole was, they call him Albert. Albert was the only man we ever met who kept every promise he ever made to us. So I'm asking, I'm just a kid. I'm asking Bud, so help me understand how you do that. He said, quit making promises. He said, I don't make promises that I'm not going to keep. And I watched him. He used to carry a little steno pad, and every trip to Russia had like Russia, March 1984. And he wrote down everything he promised. To your point about vows, he made a vow. If he knew that he was not going to be able to keep that promise, he would not make that vow. And I learned a lot watching that guy, because when you go overseas in a place where people are poor, you start making all these promises. Sure, yeah, I'll try to find a way to get you a bus, or whatever. I found chapter 5 really helpful to me because I live and die by my talking. And he says, guard your mouth, be careful, do not let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, don't make vows. He also talks about the vanity of wealth and honor. I thought that was interesting, by the way, because in our culture, wealth is measured in possessions and money. And power. In more Eastern culture, wealth is measured by honor, by shame and honor. And he, of course, lives in that culture, that Eastern culture, and he takes them both to task. I tend to think of, wow, honor is better than wealth. But he says, yeah, there's kind of a motivation behind both of those. Chapter 6, real quick.
Major theme is lack of satisfaction in toiling, but you don't get to enjoy it.
Anything else? Gary, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think, you know, there's a lack of satisfaction, and it kind of describes, I mean, you might get everything you want from God, and then you can't enjoy it, and you die, or you might, you know, either if you do enjoy it, or if you do get it, you may not enjoy it, or you may die and somebody else gets it. It doesn't matter. You're never really satisfied. So there's kind of the implication of being content. Recognize that you'll never be satisfied, but with that, be content.
Mm-hmm.
You say, am I saying that?
Yeah, summary, man is hungry but never satisfied.
Yeah. Boy, yeah, right there, verse 7. All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied.
Yeah, that's what we thought was the key.
So, we got 8 minutes left, and I want to use these 8 minutes really well if we can. Probably what we just went through, I doubt very much that many of us learned something brand new that we'd never heard before. Especially if you've been around church at all in your life, you've learned these ideas, whether it's from the teaching of Jesus or the epistles or Solomon or whatever, reading in the Psalms. So why, you know what my question is, why do we keep living like this?
Sinners.
Well, I know that, but there has to be some way out. I mean, right? I mean, we are sinners, and we are spiritually lazy and intellectually lazy and all other kinds of laziness. We default toward, not moving out and moving in the right direction. But is it that the pain and futility is just not enough for us, and God has to turn the burner up till we just scream and say, I give? Or so talk about that for just a few minutes. Why is this so hard for us? Yeah, pride is certainly at the core of it, and it shows up in a lot of different ways. Pride. What else?
Motivation for our desires.
I'm sorry?
Motivation for our desires. It drives us. Whatever makes us feel good.
I think there's an element of closeness to God in the fact that He has created some of these things for us to enjoy, but we are perverting them, taking them outside of what God has designed, i.e. sex, i.e. food, i.e. Money, power, whatever, certain things. So I think that there is an element we're trying to stay holy, but we're imperfectly fulfilling that.
Mm. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
You want to be God.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, and we're looking at verse 2 in chapter 6, where it says, a man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God does not give him power to enjoy them. The stranger enjoys them. But, I think God has placed in us a drive and a desire, a drive for those desires, I guess you could say. But at the same time, it's just like architecture. We're still practicing, never perfect. And we're in this life, it's an imperfect reflection of what will be perfect when we're with God for eternity. So even though there's a natural tendency to strive for that, for those desires, we won't ever be satisfied in this world.
So it's part of His creative design in us that reflects His image. God's a worker, we're a worker. God's a thinker, He's a creator. He's an artist, He's a musician, He's a poet, He's all these things. He's a builder. And so we have that DNA, so to speak, in us, created in His image. It's just what we do with it just got perverted early on. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Longing got shifted from a longing for God because He created us with that longing. So
Yeah.
the longing for God, it's the longing for whatever pleases Him.
We were designed to be in Eden, I guess you could say. God knew we were going to sin and get thrown out of the garden, so to speak. But we were designed for all those longings to be fulfilled in our relationship with God. all of a sudden we're thrown out of the garden, and sin has caused us, we haven't necessarily lost those desires, but we're looking to fulfill them, and all the stuff in the world that's, I mean, it's nothing wrong with it, it's good. The beauty that we see in the world, in nature, and each other, and all those kind of things, there's nothing wrong with that, but they by themselves won't satisfy us because, it's not a perfected world with God.
Yeah, and that's where the gospel comes in so powerfully, because that's the redemption. The gospel is about way more than just us getting to heaven, getting forgiven and getting to heaven. God is in the process of redeeming everything about our lives, everything in the creation. The creation is now groaning. And so the gospel is so critical because it gives meaning to what got lost in the meaning in the past. And so we fast forward to, for example, Paul talking to the Colossians, and he says, whatever work you do that work heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men, knowing that the Lord Christ is the master whom you serve and that you will receive a reward. That's a whole different mindset about going to work tomorrow morning than what Solomon is projecting here. And so the gospel starts to bring relevance and meaning to everything. It's part of, we're redeemed and we're being redeemed. It's that perfect tense that God, in his mind, it's done, yet we're living it out in time and space, and painfully so from time to time. But you see the emphasis of joy in the New Testament. Even Christ going to the cross, it says in Hebrews 12, for the joy set before him, knowing what he was going to suffer, there was a joy in the work that he was going to do to redeem us and to redeem our lives. So this is a great book to teach, as long as you also teach the other stuff, right? This is Solomon's version of a grief observed, or a crummy life observed, or whatever. I love that verse toward the beginning. He says it's a sad business, this thing that God has given us, this life that God has given us to live. There's some truth in that. But we find joy, don't we? Because God has a way of redeeming every moment. And we were just talking this week with our daughter about the past and the future and so forth, and how God is, the prophet Joel, how he's redeeming, he's giving back the years that the locusts ate. I love that phrase. You see that in Peter. He's walking on the beach. Why does Jesus ask him 3 times? The simple answer is he denied him 3 times. But the deeper answer to me is, yes, that's true, but Jesus was taking back, step by step, every piece of ground that Peter lost. He's redeeming every piece of ground that Peter lost to bring him back to where he was and beyond, and set him on the course of being the leader of the church in Jerusalem. It's that redemptive thing that keeps me in this game, that keeps me walking with Christ, that keeps me working in church, doing the things that I do. I just see the Lord is so redemptive, and he loves to take futility. He loves to take impossible, futile things and just turn them into, it's like the desert in Israel when you're there. If you've ever been to Israel, it can be desert, and then there's just this green everywhere, and there's fruit and vegetables everywhere, and there's palm trees and coconut tree, and it's what God does. That's what God does. He takes the desert of our life and he turns it into lush greenness, no matter what Solomon said. I feel sad when I finish Ecclesiastes, because I know that by the time he gets done, as far as I can tell, and I'm not an expert, but as far as I can tell, he's well into worshiping the gods of his alien wives, not alien wives, but, foreign wives. His temple and his palace are filled with this kind of stuff, and he's been drawn away from the living God. And by the time you get to chapter 12, how he describes what it's like to be an old man. He talks about being careful as you walk. He talks about the golden bowl, you know, the silver cord being broken, how the grinders aren't there anymore. He talks about the hands shaking. You know, he's describing he's an old man. And there's a lot of old men that are happy, a lot of old women that are happy. He's not a happy old man, not a joyful one. And he's tried everything. We at least have some things yet to try out, right? we can go try and pursue some stuff, but he had it all. He did it all. However long he wanted to do it, as often as he wanted to do it. And he gets to the end and says, fear God, right? Fear God. Find meaning in your work. What's that? Yeah, he reminds me of an old guy sitting there talking to his great-grandson saying, before I die, I just want to tell you, you keep living like that, this is what you become. That's kind of what I see. Hey, thanks for coming tonight, getting this kicked off. We'll meet again next week, chapter 7, study chapter 7. It's a great chapter. It's my favorite chapter in Ecclesiastes. He makes this statement, it's better to go to a funeral than to go to a Jaguars party. Why would he say that? So everybody met everybody. You got to know everybody. I just want to make sure. Hey, Father, thank you for the way you love us, the unbelievable wisdom of your word, and how you help us to understand it by your Spirit. Thank you for these folks who could have been anywhere other than here tonight, and yet they chose to be here in your presence. They chose to open your book and to listen to your Spirit. And I pray that you would bless them for that. I pray that as they leave here tonight, go home, whether it's with children or with a spouse or alone or whatever their circumstances are, I pray that you would be the presence, the great presence in their life, the one who gives meaning to every single laughter, every single tear, every drop of sweat, every drop of blood that we give in this life. We long for you to give permanence and meaning to everything that we do. Thank you for your love. Amen. Thanks, guys.